Thank you very much, Jo Marie, and thanks to all of you. I feel like I will learn a lot from the other speakers and the conversation because I am largely focused on administering ODA, so that's my area of specialization. So I'm going to talk not about how we can think of alternatives to ODA, but how ODA can play a role in a new way of looking at development. Now, the biggest challenge is, of course, starting the presentation. So let me try that. Okay. All right. Okay. So I think that among the variety of instruments for development that can be used, ODA has a continuing role to play, but it's quite a different role from what we may have envisioned in the past. And I'd like to touch on three themes, really. First of all, how US ODA fits into the overall picture now relative to its role in the past. And second, although we think of many countries as poor and facing serious issues of poverty, we are finding increasingly that many of the formerly poor countries are moving into middle income status, and actually some quite poor countries are growing very rapidly. So the situation is not static, and I think that's an important factor, because what it means is that for many countries, the influence that the U.S. can have is not really necessarily just our money. We don't need to spend our money on helping countries pay for services. It also means that in an environment of relative scarcity of resources, we can take our traditional ODA funds and concentrate them more intensively on the poorer countries. And then I'd like to talk about a possible way of shifting ODA from paying for things to partnering, brokering, and advising, and use the example of working on tax administration. So what's changing about official development assistance? Those of you who listened to Secretary Clinton's speech in Busan probably heard her say that in the 1960s, ODA was, 73% of U.S. transfers to developing countries, and now it's 14%. So it doesn't mean that U.S. ODA has gone down. If anything, U.S. ODA has actually increased. But what's happening is that the overall financial markets are changing dramatically, have changed dramatically over this 50-year period. So looking at this graph, you can see what I find remarkable not only is that the private capital flows outstrip the ODA, but also that the volatility that's often people claim that US ODA, one of the problems is volatility, but it's much less volatile than private capital flows. So what that means is that whereas ODA moves in and out of countries with a specific development objective, private capital does not. And so it's much more volatile. But you can see in 2010, the level of US ODA is much higher than it was in 1960, but the share that it represents of total capital flows from the United States to developing countries is much lower. Now, one of the things that my colleagues and I first wondered about when we saw this and were a little bit surprised is, well, that's ODA, but perhaps the red line is mostly private philanthropy. In fact, it's not. It's largely commercial capital flows. The private philanthropy is still a relatively small share. So what does moving on to a second topic, because we have little time and I just want to throw out a few ideas, what are the ramifications of rapid lower and middle income country growth? And I'm just taking the example of the area where I work. So, a number of the countries in Africa that we're working with are moving toward what many countries in Asia have already experienced, where in a 3-year period they're expected to grow their economies by 25%. 2.5%. Well, that means that things that were not possible in the past are now becoming possible. So if we look at basic health services, those of you who followed the literature in global health probably are familiar with the 1993 World Development Report on investing in health, which showed that if we invested $10 to $12 per capita in developing countries, it would pay for a basic package of services. Then that work was really the basis for an additional piece of work in 2001 by the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, where they looked at, again, how much does it cost to provide people in developing countries with essential health care? And they estimated $38, including actually dealing with the problem of AIDS. And if you project that out using the medical price index in the United States, you can see this trend line of what it costs to provide basic services. Again, and the Task Force on Innovative Financing came up with a more comprehensive package, and that one costs $54 per capita because it focuses also not only on the service part of the package, but also on the health system components. How do you build the health systems to provide that package? So we have this, if you look over time and you project out with the medical price index, you see kind of over time what we expect that package of services to cost. Then let's take the case of India. At the time of the Commission on Macroeconomics and Health, India was spending, I think, $16 per capita on healthcare. So really, India could not afford to provide its population with a basic, essential service package. But now, in fact, India has moved beyond the being able to afford the basic package, and even including the health system strengthening components. We anticipate that India within the next couple of years will be able to fully afford that with domestic resources. And here you can see, again, India, but looking also at the ODA as the percent of total health expenditure in India. So whereas in 2001, the ODA represented 3% of India's health spending. Now it represents about 1%, 1.5%. Actually, I guess 2012, it's more like 2%. So this means, first of all, I think for many countries, not all countries, there's a decline in the need for US ODA to actually pay for basic services. And there's also much less that we can really accomplish using just our money. Because, I mean, when we're, 10% of a health sector with our contributions, we can really influence how things are done. When we're less than 1%, basically, we're working at the margins, and so the way we work has to change. Now I'd like to just quickly move to the some ideas for a new way of considering US ODA, using the example of improving low and middle income country tax administration. Again, I'm working on global health, so tax administration is not my forte, so please keep that in mind, but I just wanted to use that as an illustration of how our model for working with other countries can change. So what is the opportunity that we're addressing? We have countries that are growing rapidly. They have expanding middle classes. They actually have domestic resources available that can support development objectives. And this also is a way of fostering greater country ownership. But that doesn't mean that they will necessarily be able to harness those domestic resources for development, because they need to figure out how to capture those resources. They also have the potential of using tax policy domestically to achieve other objectives. So, for example, to improve their environment, using tax incentives to promote clean technologies, to promote changes in the use of fuel. Also, the way countries structure their land and property taxes can affect the returns to producers. And as the capital flows become more complex and trade becomes a bigger part of their economies, they actually will have more complex tax administration requirements. So if they're not able to administer their tax systems, they won't be able to mobilize these domestic resources for development purposes. So one of the things that we can consider is taking some of the money that we use to actually deliver services or to buy inputs and instead use that to match or to leverage domestic resources. So if we partner with a developing country and we work with them to improve their tax administration, we can generate more money, more of their money, help them generate more of their money by using our resources to help them with developing a roadmap. We can, instead of necessarily providing direct technical assistance, we can partner to broker connections with other parts of our own government that are knowledgeable about tax administration. We can also move from paying for things to being the party that assumes greater risk or helps countries to manage risk. And also, we can take our own local or domestic knowledge of new technologies and help countries incorporate those new technologies, such as mobile tax payments. So I just wanted to stop there because I'm not a tax administration specialist, but I thought I'd just use that as an example since your focus is on financial instruments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Maybe in the question and discussion period, we can get at the regional tax administration conferences in Latin America and in Africa. They're very, very strong regional bodies, and learn more about what the Treasury and AID and State Department are doing as well, because I know that you're doing stuff, I don't know what you're doing. Okay.